Well, hello again, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I am here on deck 8 in a Jeffries tube. There's not a lot of place on the ship that is quiet these days, as we're getting ready to get into some maintenance and that sort of thing. People are getting going, and so anyway, I'm here, and I want to talk about the rise of antebellum slavery in the United States today. That's our topic, and it's a rather somber topic, but it's an important topic to talk about. And so let's begin with a look at the landscape of slavery as we come out of the War of 1812. There were a couple of things that happened before the War of 1812 that really begin to change the nature of slavery and the slave system in the United States. The first is, of course, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, and this kicks off the cotton boom in the lower or deep South. And this will really go on steroids after the War of 1812. Prior to the War of 1812, there's trouble with trade and that sort of thing. But after the War of 1812, things really begin to crank up. The second thing that happens prior to the War of 1812 is that constitutionally in 1808, the international slave trade is ended. And this is significant because just at a time when the demand for slaves under the slave system is rising because of the growth of the cotton industry, the spigot internationally is turned off. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't smuggling. There is lots of smuggling, probably most famously in the Amistad case between 1839 and 1841. But beyond that, the spigot is turned off. And so we begin to see a domestic slave trade and the rise of a primarily domestic slave trade, which is just, even worse, if it can be, in many ways than the older system. That's debatable. But anyway, the slave system begins to change as a result of the Cotton Kingdom, and so this is really what raises this new morph of American slavery. The cotton gin itself is like a comb that gently combs out the seeds of the cotton from the fibers without ruining the fibers of short staple cotton. And so that's kind of what that does. This makes for a very prosperous, at first anyway, a very prosperous commodity because it is sold both internationally, mainly to England, and also to the north, to the mills that are developing beginning in about the 1820s, 1820s, up in the northern areas. So the first thing to understand about this is that slavery is interconnected in every state in the Union, that it's not just the South. Certainly there are shippers in the North, there are mill owners in the North, there are bankers in the North that are profiting from the slavery and the slave system. And so that's the first thing to know about this. Now, how does the slave system work? Well, we talked a little bit about this in class, but it is based on that 2% of the planter aristocracy. These are the folks that own over 100 slaves. These are the people that run this system and make this system work. These are the ones that have the power to make this system work. And so that is the planter aristocracy, and the planter aristocracy has these plantations. The plantations generally are run. The slave part of the plantations are run by a poor white called an overseer, and then there are drivers that are slaves, kind of slave leaders below that, and then there are gangs, as they were called, below that, and that was kind of the way that slavery worked in an agricultural setting in this time period. There were also house slaves that would be forced to help around the house and that sort of thing. And so we'll talk about all of that, but that was the planter aristocracy. Now, in the slave system, there was this delineation between house slaves and field slaves. Although the field slave work was much more arduous, when we listen to the WPA narratives of former slaves talking about their enslavement, they generally say that they would rather have been a field slave than a house slave, because at least they could, after their work, they could kind of let down a little bit, whereas house slaves living in the house all the time had to be on guard all the time. And in some ways that was even more cruel than being a field slave. So in this hierarchy of this caste system of slavery, there was the planter aristocracy, and then the majority of the white folks in the South were the poor whites, who did not own slaves, who kind of had this distorted American dream that if they, through hard work, etc., they could own other human beings, and that would be their American dream, to get a farm and do that sort of thing. And so this I believe is one of the things that will really cause the Civil War, is when these poor whites way of life is threatened, and their perceived ability to achieve the American dream is threatened. They're willing to fight for that. That's one of the ingredients going into all of this. There's another class of person in the South during this time period, and these are the free blacks in the South in the antebellum period. And these are folks that you don't hear about a whole lot. And increasingly, as we get through the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, these folks will be increasingly kind of living on a razor's edge, because they didn't fit well within the system that had this caste system that had been built within by the white ruling class. And so these folks would be like blacksmiths or barrel makers, or they had some trade, some skill, and they would travel from place to place and ply their trade, and they could keep the money that they made. Even then, they had to have what was called a sponsor. So they had to have a white Southern sponsor that would be quote unquote responsible for them, which shows kind of the racism, the just deep racism in all of this. So even when they were free, they weren't free. And so that was the Southern free blacks, which is an interesting complexity to all of this. And so what was life like for these folks? The best record that we have are some of the slave narratives from the WPA project, where there are interviews of former slaves talking about this. And life was dismal for these folks. They were undernourished, they were underhoused, they were underclothed, and they were beaten. And the beatings were quite intense. I mean, and the South liked to say that they had laws against all of this, right? That you couldn't make a slave work, for example, on Sundays unless it was for punishment. But there was always the but, right? Always the exception. And so that was kind of what was going on, and we'll talk more in class about some of the specifics on that. But it was just a terrible sun up to sundown existence for the field hands, and never off work if you were a house slave. And this doesn't even get into any of the urban slavery, which is a whole nother aspect of slavery that we here won't have time to talk about, but that was going on as well. And so, not surprisingly, there were a series of uprisings, some that came to fruition and many that didn't during this time period. Most notably, in 1831, there was Nat Turner's Rebellion. And unfortunately, for the slave populations that were involved in these, and all of the slave population that were involved, that even didn't directly be involved in all of this, the result of these revolts or these uprisings was that the white population would clamp down on the slave population with tighter and tighter regulations around their movements and behaviors. And so that was a consequence of the slave revolts. And so that's what's going on there. Slaves did sometimes run away, and there were laws around that, of course. Even the case law that came about during this time about laws around returning slaves and fugitive slaves and that sort of thing, because it gets to be what's called a comity issue between states that had slavery and states that didn't have slavery, and that sort of thing. And we'll talk much more about that in class as well. So what begins to happen beginning around 1830 is the rise of an abolitionist movement in the United States. And this comes from there was a big anti-slavery convention in London shortly after England abolishes slavery. And this is really an impulse for these abolitionists. Now, the first thing to know about these abolitionists is that they were not ever in the mainstream of society. Their views were seen as radical and extreme. Even in the North, there were mobs that were anti-abolitionist that would burn down buildings in Philadelphia, for example. Or in the 1820s, Elijah P. Lovejoy, one of the early abolitionists, was dragged from his home and killed in Illinois for being an abolitionist. And this is all happening in the North, right? So abolitionists were not in the mainstream ever. So they really took risks to fight for the abolition of slavery and equality of the races. And so this radical abolitionism, there are a few people that you should be familiar with. Sojourner Truth, whose real name was Isabella Baumfree. There was Frederick Douglass. There was William Lloyd Garrison, and many, many others that were willing to stand up for the rights of these people. And what they would do first is they would have meetings and they would give testimonies. Frederick Douglass would talk about his time as a slave, and that sort of thing. And they would try to convince people that this was worth fighting for. They would also send literature to the South. This, of course, upset the slave-owning South, so much so that they got federal laws passed against sending abolitionist literature in the mail. They also felt very threatened by this, so they developed what they called the positive good argument, where they said, well, look, we take care of our folks from cradle to grave, and you don't do that in the North. In the North, you have wage slavery, and if someone is out of work, that's too bad. Which is kind of a a false argument, because these wage slaves had more of a choice about working or not. Well, they had to work, but they were not slaves. They were free. They were not a dependent, permanent labor force. And so that's kind of an introduction to slavery and the slave system. We will see through the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that this abolitionist movement will gain steam, but it will never become part of the mainstream. It's always seen at the time period as an extremist position. And we will see that how that combined with the extension question about where is slavery going to exist and where is it not going to exist will become increasingly the big questions of this 30-year period before the Civil War. So that's what I have for you today. Have a great day, and we will see you later.